Hey everybody, well now it's the 6th anniversary of me living in Ukraine and the Ukrainian Revolution, also known as Euromaidan. In this video I'm going to explain to you why this revolution was inevitable. This video is titled Trying Not to Drown. And so imagine physically being on a boat while at sea and trying to see what part goes where and trying to build that actual boat. And all at the same time trying not to drown. So this kind of characterizes Ukraine perfectly in 2013 as I saw it. And in this video, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I saw in Ukraine when I first visited this place in 2012. I didn't know anything much about this country. I mean, I'm half Russian and half Ukrainian, sure. I was born here, I left the country as a little kid, but I didn't really know or care at all, really, about this country. And I kind of identified myself as a Canadian anyway. Lived there for 20 years, right? Why do I care about anything political in Ukraine, right? But while in Canada, between 2004 and 2014, whole 10 years that I was there, it seemed to me that in that period, there was tensions between Russia and Ukraine at the same time. I mean, if you remember, there was these gas wars, Tymoshenko, Yushchenko situation. I'm not too sure what happened there, but that kind of mentality, sort of, to bicker and stuff, that kind of, I thought it was a little strange, but at the same time, who cares, right? I'm living there in Canada. I don't really care much about this stuff. So I came to Ukraine in 2012 with a fresh set of eyes. I could look at everything and analyze everything that way. And what did I see in 2012? Well, I saw that Ukraine was sort of, which just found strange, it was sort of living in the shadows of Russia. And Russia considered it to be part of a greater whole, or itself. When you think about the Soviet Union, Ukraine only became independent in 1991, so you can imagine it doesn't take a genius to understand that the whole government was infiltrated with Russian Secret Service and Russian intelligence in Ukraine. I mean, you had that. And Ukraine being such an integral part of the Soviet Union meant that Ukraine, as opposed to Poland, for example, it got the brunt of the Soviet ideology, oppression, and apatheticism that I think it was ingrained into the population as a whole, in people's minds. This also allowed corruption to flourish and become a fixture in society as well. So basically, in Ukraine, corruption can't really be understood without understanding the central feature of the Soviet society. The societal problems I noticed were, number one, I think there was a bit of moral degradation in the public sphere. So there was this systematic loss over time of the moral compass that people had. And virtuality. By that I mean that the practice is also systematically pretending that things are different than they actually are. There's sort of like self-denial, right? Another issue was social sort of automatization, individualization of burden. So this is like a lack of responsibility, individual responsibility. And in turn, it was also a lack of responsibility for the country as well. Then there was also the formation of the actual legal system, the rule of law, and that was either minimally present or altogether absent in many cases. So let's talk about the two crucial things about Ukraine and Ukrainian society and the elite. You have the Ukrainian society and the elite, these two crucial things. Well, let's start with the elite. What is the Ukrainian elite? Basically, the oligarchic clans or criminal elements that developed in Russia in the 90s also developed in Ukraine, right? And Ukraine organically established these oligarchical clans or criminal elements first in the cities, in the major cities, and then they established regionally. And the biggest of these two clans were the Donetsk clan and the Dnipropetrovsk clan. And to understand their influences, that will be another story, I guess. But just so you know, they're in the south and the southeast of Ukraine. So the northern Ukraine is sort of like it plays to the tunes of what's going on in the southern Ukraine. Anyway, every single Ukrainian oligarch really is a multi-billionaire, right? And they do have a fairly diverse set of investments in natural resources, communication, whatever, media, whatnot. They always have something akin of a small army that, if necessary, could be called on to protect their interests. The fighters in these armies typically worked for different security agencies or trained in sports clubs and whatnot. They were they were financed obviously by these oligarchs. And when time came, they could be called on by the oligarch to, to further promote his or her interests. And during the Maidan revolutions in 2013, 2014, they really played a pivotal role in shaping public opinion, in scare tactics and whatnot. The courts were also involved. It's another interesting thing. So, like, imagine a country where an oligarch can actually pass like a sham lawsuit. This has actually happened. This is a true story. An oligarch passed a sham lawsuit over debt to his business partner. Let's say they own like an oil refinery or something else like that, and using the connections with the government, the oligarch could guarantee a certain court ruling, and that was like pretty much a license to print money, wasn't it? Right? I mean, you just do whatever you want. You guarantee that a court's going to rule in your favor, and that's it. Again, this happens, right? This happened 2012, 2013, before that. Imagine a country where to see somebody you have to, like an official, you actually have to bring like, $50,000 in your suitcase in order just to see that person, to actually step into his office. I mean, that was the situation that Ukraine has deteriorated to when it comes to the elite. Before I talk about society, let's talk about the president. Let's talk about the role of the president in this whole thing. So, Ukrainian presidents came and went, right? They all had to juggle these internal oligarchs, manage the constitution was actually, being formed. They were trying to build it. It needed fine-tuning. There were a lot of holes in the law and all that stuff. And there was no complete framework or understanding of private property, the transfer of private property, the taxation. There was no understanding of any of that, like labor laws. I mean, good luck. So what was different with the Kuchma, who was a president between 1994 and 2005, and Yanukovych, 2010 to 2014, was that they were both clan leaders in and of themselves. So basically, they ended up governing a country as a personal empire due to the diversity of Ukrainian society, and Ukraine as a nation never really got a chance to develop because of that. Or there was no equilibrium, because like if one clan governs, right, well, there's no equilibrium. There's no checks and balances are not really there, right? And that was the reason why Kuchma and Yanukovych both were not successful in continuing the legacies. So where does the Ukrainian society fit in all of that? Well, there was an American. I'm gonna tell you a story. There was an American that did like 2 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he traveled across Ukraine in 2011 or so. That was like a year before I actually went there. I'm not sure what his name was. In his memoirs, he encountered new people and new thoughts and new opinions and crucial issues like the role of language, the role of Russia, and how they see the Ukrainian state as a whole, how they see themselves. And this was an important revelation because I actually felt the same way. Here's a guy that never actually set foot on Ukrainian soil, and he sees this, and he was like, this is like a ticking time bomb, really. He right away drew conclusion that this country wasn't going to last in its form. He saw the same tension in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan when he was doing tours there. So he has something to compare it to. So for any sort of equilibrium in Ukraine to be had, I think there had to be someone in power that could be willing to balance both the criminal element, develop and make progress in the rule of law without stepping on anyone's toes, and walk a fine line, obviously, between the West, Europe, Russia, and of course, also he had to enrich himself in the process. I mean, and gain influence within the inner circle. I mean, that's also one of the reasons why people get into politics, right? Let's talk about what kind of Ukraine did Yanukovych inherit. Well, let's first take a look at who lives in southern and eastern Ukraine. Due to the history of these regions and the overall predominantly working class populations, the people in these regions, they're only really been able to compare each other, themselves really, to Russia. Sentimentality or sympatheticism or oligarchic rules that were governing those areas. And the result was that it turned the population very, very apathetic towards what was going on in the surrounding areas. Let me live my life, and I don't really care who's in power. That was the majority of these people's opinion. And one of the reasons for that was because since these were predominantly working class, predominantly industry-based their livelihood really depended on these oligarchs because they owned the steel mills, the coal mines, the whatnot, fertilizer factories, oil refineries, all of that. So what I actually observed was that Ukraine was not really split between the East and West. It was split between those who are apathetic towards Ukraine and those who care. And there's just a lot more people that are apathetic in the East, but nobody would really be pro-Russian, even in that sense, because apatheticism was a consequence and I guess a symptom of a bigger disease, and that was the lack of Ukrainian sort of unified Ukrainian voice, Ukrainian. Don't get me wrong, Ukrainians were, many of them were suspicious of the EU and the West, and they were obviously fervent defenders of Yanukovych and his policies and him as well. But at the same time, there ended up being this unilateral discontent with the deteriorating economic situation and the actual behavior of Yanukovych. That was really what did him in, his behavior. Not, he did have a little bit of support here and there, but it was his behavior that really did him in. So let's talk about where did Yanukovych really go wrong? Where did he go? What did he do that caused Ukraine to go on track to the revolution? So as some fringe discontent started brewing, more and more journalists, investigative journalists, honest policemen, or regular citizens started noticing these peculiarities, right? What these people have done as they've tried to investigate the corruption and obvious extravagant lifestyle of the president or his inner circle, or maybe even any kind of deputies, or maybe just the ministry, right? The Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Supreme Court, the prosecutor's office, any of that. When they've even gotten close to these bodies, the relatives started getting threats. The kidnapping started. Random thugs would just beat them up as they were walking on the street on the way home, right? Their car would be burned, the car would be vandalized. So like you could get a criminal charge, right? These people could get a criminal charge and an accusation which they had to disprove in court, and yeah, good luck with that. I've already talked about the courts, what they were like. And that was the feeling that I actually had in my bones when I was walking around Ukraine in 2012, 2013, right? I'm thinking like, I'd hope I'd never end up in court in Ukraine. I hope I'd never end up in a police like interrogation room or something, or just I hope I'd never actually even interact with a police officer, simply because it was like, I had this feeling that it was like Stalin and NKVD, going on around here, and the Spanish Inquisition, I don't know how you want to call it. It was that kind of, atmosphere in the air that was doing it all in, right? And then, as you can imagine, this whole situation actually ended up going out of control. And I started realizing something that you could probably be killed here and be made an example out of. And all of this would be approved at the top of the ranks, and nobody would know or nobody would do anything about it whatsoever, because there was no channel, there was no way to do anything about that kind of stuff. So let's say someone dies. Did it happen? It did happen. In Ukraine, journalists have disappeared before, especially under Yanukovych, and beat up and whatnot. But let's say somebody dies. As soon as that death or disappearance happened, the finger pointing will start. And this is like a fixture of Ukraine, maybe Russia as well. But at that time, it was a fixture of Ukraine. The finger pointing started, right? So what happened the following days? Let's say the opposition was also in this, right? They say the activists should be murdered, right? Oh yeah, you killed the activists by the opposition. And this would provoke a conflict between the Yanukovych and the opposition, right? Or Yanukovych, he needs to get something, to get rid of somebody, right? Somebody could use Yanukovych of the situation, and then, oh, it's a provocation, you want to destabilize the government, or blah, blah, blah. And as you can see, the desire to silence the journalist or get rid of a journalist comes from all angles. It was both beneficial for the Ukrainian government and the opposition that was in place at that time. And amongst all the smoke and mirrors, you really had no way to battle the situation. So Another thing that happened is that the prosecutor's office quite literally closed any sort of case that an activist would bring up to them. And if a police officer or a prosecutor's officer brings forward a accusation against the journalist, then the prosecutor's office would open it up and pursue it. And then boom, the activist gets the criminal charge. So it wasn't just the journalists though that received this kind of treatment. It was like, European-minded people that stood for fairness, people that, even fair policemen, right? Anti-corruption bodies, NGOs of all shapes and sizes. And, furthermore, to even make things worse, the Yanukovych government felt more and more emboldened and empowered to do even more things, to rub salt in the wounds, to make it worse for the average person, to showcase this power over everybody else, even like while walking on the street. I mean, I've seen it myself, right? What they used to do is they used to block off the main street for 15 minutes, and all the cars, like in rush hour, are waiting there while the presidential motorcade went by, and people were doing they used the government cars, like blacked out cars with these strobe lights that were went on the opposite side of the street and tried to pass everybody, and everybody just let them through. Nobody protested, none of that. And I've actually seen this feeling of defeatism that was prevalent in Ukraine at that time, and that feeling I couldn't really shake it off at all. And it was there I'm sure before I first visited Ukraine in 2012. It was probably there in 2013 and 2015, later maybe even a little bit. But after the revolution, it was different. Anybody who'd moved to Ukraine, like myself, were seen as this somebody who just voluntarily went down to the deepest rung of hell. I mean, the societal environment shook me to the core, and it was difficult to understand by the average Ukrainian why a foreigner would want to come here at all. So, but ironically, this is one of the reasons that drew me to Ukraine and that actually made me want to stay here. The desire to help somehow and be part of this transformation that I saw unraveling before my eyes. So in the next video, I'll explain who exactly caused the Maidan revolution, and maybe you guys are gonna like it. Anyway, hit like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.